Ну что я могу вам сказать?
Vladimir Putin has been in power for 25 years, and throughout this time he has managed to create structures and mechanisms to maintain and execute control over every part of the Russian state. But something more is behind this force: concepts and ideas that reinforce his rule and capture the minds and hearts of the Russian people. We look at the narratives and stories the Kremlin uses to legitimize its actions and hold on to power.
Огромный русский мир, который никогда не строился исключительно и только по этническому, национальному или религиозному признаку.
One of the most significant narratives is the concept of the Russian world.
Po rosyjsku ruski mir, która jest taką, powiedziałabym, sztandarową.
In Russian, Ruski Mir, which I would say is the Kremlin's flagship narrative. It's a concept that was initially identified with the Kremlin's foreign policy doctrine and a soft power tool. The idea was to somehow connect and attract Russian diasporas to Russia, to use these diasporas for political purposes, to use cultural institutions of various kinds to influence the international community in a soft and friendly way, and not by force, using especially these cultural, diplomatic tools and so on. Initially, when this concept of the Russian world appeared in the narrative of Putin and his entourage, it had this dimension, i.e., it was a cultural, civilizational concept. I would say, however, that over the years it has taken on a harder dimension, a more aggressive dimension, and at this point we can call it a geopolitical concept that has basically been instrumentally used by the Kremlin to justify its aggression against Ukraine. This is a concept that specifically assumes that the countries on Soviet territory, which were created after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, are countries that should be subordinate to Russia, that are in the Russian cultural circle, especially the Orthodox countries, because an important role as an agent in this concept, an agent of the Kremlin, in this concept of the Russian world is played by the Orthodox Church. Among other things, it is used directly to sanctify the war. For example, it gives it this mystical dimension as a struggle between good and evil. Yet another concept that overlaps the concept of the Russian world is that of the Holy Roose.
Jest wykorzystywana przez władze do sakralizacji władzy państwowej, do tego, żeby...
It is used by the authorities for the realization of state power to achieve various social political goals, not only in Russia, but also internationally. The concept of Holy Roose comes back to the time when orthodoxy appeared in the eastern lands. Russia considers itself the defender of not only Orthodox values, but Christian values in general. The West is in decline and turning away from Christian values, and it is Russia that nurtures these Christian values in the Orthodox dimension. So this is a very effective tool in the hands of the Kremlin, and it may not be positively received in Western Europe, but I believe that in other parts of the world, in Africa or Latin America or in the Middle East, where Russia had stood up for Christian communities, these slogans are being heard, and Russia is playing them very well in terms of propaganda. And on top of these concepts, linked to religion, linked to orthodoxy, there is also a third concept, the concept of a third Rome. They are all interrelated. This concept is raised by some intellectuals around the Kremlin or associated with Orthodox Christianity, and it says that while the first Rome, or the Roman Empire, fell, then Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire fell, Russia is the heir to these very traditions of Eastern Christianity. And Russia is the only state that can now take on the title of the Third Rome. Yet another slogan that appears in addition to those mentioned is the idea of the unity of the triune Russian nation.
Brzmi to dość skomplikowanie, ale już wyjaśniam. Chodzi o to, że...
It sounds rather complicated, but I can explain. Russians, or representatives of the Russian elite, believe that the Russian nation is a very broadly understood community, and it also includes the Ukrainian nation and the Belarusian nation, and sometimes Moldova is included in this group, depending on the author of the statement. The point is that it is all one cultural community. This Russian nation is understood here in a very broad way. That is, to put it bluntly, they are all Eastern Slavs. Even today, they should be one nation and have been forcibly separated by hostile forces coming, of course, from the West. Russia is fighting to unite this nation, because its historical role is to make this nation one. These words were also stated more than once by Patriarch Kirill, who even said in his sermons that the war in Ukraine is a war for the Russian people to be united. These concepts appear primarily in the Kremlin's propaganda narrative. The main propaganda instrument is Russian state television, speeches by Vladimir Putin, Patriarch Kirill, and various government officials. These narratives include slogans about Russia's messianic role, the role of saving the world and saving Christian civilization. It is meant to reassure Russians that they are the chosen people with a great mission, and under Putin, Russia is carrying out this historic mission of saving the world from evil.
Ta mesjanistyczna narracja w rosyjskiej propagandzie idzie w takim kierunku wręcz karykaturalnym, wręcz absurdalnym.
This messianic narrative in Russian propaganda is moving towards a caricatured, almost absurd direction, because there are more and more references to the fact that Russia is fighting against Satanism, that Russia is fighting the devil. In general, the sacralization of Russia's role in the international arena is already widely present in Russian propaganda. Before that, just a few years ago, only some individual propagandists were talking about it, and these were almost extreme views. Whereas now, I can say it has gone mainstream. And this is how the Kremlin wants the Russian public to perceive these rivalries between Russia and the West, or even the conflict between Russia and the West that is playing out in relation to this conventional war that Russia has unleashed in Ukraine. These concepts linked to orthodoxy appear, for example, in the discourse offered by Alexander Dugin, a kind of ideologue, an Orthodox philosopher who has appeared quite frequently on Russian television recently. Of course, he justifies the war in Ukraine, saying that Russia is carrying out a historical mission there.
Эта война – это не только война армий, людей, это еще и война духа.
Nie tylko właśnie walki o zjednoczenie narodu rosyjskiego.
It's not only the struggle to unite the Russian people or to save the Orthodox Church, but in general, he says that, literally, Russia is fighting Satan. And this Satan, in the understanding of Russian propaganda and Russian elites, at least part of them, is the West. The West is perceived as the greatest enemy, not only in political terms, but even in civilizational or messianic terms. The West is evil incarnated, and this has its serious social repercussions, because if we look at how Russian society relates to the West, we can see that there is a degradation of the perception of the West in Russian society. Russians perceive the West worse and worse, and indeed you can see that in this case, this propaganda is acutely effective. The West is accused of all and any evil, all of Russia's failures, all of its problems, including economic and social failures. I would even say that it has its own meme-like feature, that whatever bad thing is happening in Russia at the moment, it's the West that is responsible for everything. The West is, of course, destroying Russia and not allowing it to develop. Russians themselves are not inclined to look for failure in their own elites or in their own behavior. This is an excuse, a cop-out, and it's used instrumentally. Alongside these narratives, which Russians encounter in the media or in their contacts with the authorities, there are also more down-to-earth and existential concepts that dominate everyday life. And here we need to distinguish between the concepts of imperial and ethnic nationalism, and quite simply, conformity. Imperial nationalism makes it possible to justify Russian aggression. Russia has the right to expand because it is defending Russians. It defends orthodoxy and Russian-speaking communities. At the same time, the number of ethnic Russians is declining. At the moment, 70% of the population identifies as ethnic Russian, but even this is not a reliable number, because some respondents do not submit data to the census. There is a lot of hostility between Russians and the other ethnic groups that live in the North Caucasus or the Siberian republics. The Russian vector of nationalism also has many directions. This can be seen during various conflicts or riots. The potential for ethnic hostility is high and can easily find approval and acceptance among broad sections of society. Conformity, on the other hand, while not a formalized ideology, is widespread among Russians.
To jest społeczeństwo, które...
This is a society that does not want to be active, which does not want to contribute, which is afraid of this activity, which does not want to fight for its rights, but also, on the other hand, which would like to be comfortable, to be well off. So, if the government offers satisfying basic needs and some moderate economic growth, an increase in the standard of living, then society is satisfied. And we have observed this over more than 2 decades of Putin's rule, where he has offered society this social contract, which consisted of increasing social prosperity, slowly but nevertheless successively. In particular, the poorest and most vulnerable groups would be taken care of by the Kremlin, colloquially speaking, in return for not participating politically and not speaking out against the authorities. This has worked in Russia for many years. At the moment, we're talking about a new social contract in Russia, namely for particular groups, namely for those who are involved in the war. Welfare and various social offers from the state are reserved for them. This unfortunately also works quite well, because those groups that are important to the Kremlin from the point of view of waging war, they are quite well valued by the Kremlin. And because of this, they are quiet. They are susceptible to the Kremlin's suggestions, and they simply allow themselves to be managed, and I would even say manipulated. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, take a look at our other stories on screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.